Hello, everyone. This is Apostolos, co-founder of PNOΗ. Today, we have with us Dr. Mike Nelson. Mike, thank you very much for taking, for accepting our invitation to join the PNOΗ podcast today. You have a great experience around metabolic testing, and I'm sure that the PNOΗ community would be extremely eager to hear your experience and the way that you are utilizing PNOΗ with your clients and with your athletes. So Mike, I would love if you could share a little bit of detail, if you could share your background, your bio with our community. That's a great way to start our discussion.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me be here. Really appreciate it. I got into physiology mostly because I was a very skinny 6'3" person, weighed 156 pounds when I went to college. So I'm like, maybe I should do some of this weightlifting stuff. And then later on, many years later, I realized, oh, wow, my aerobic capacity had degraded to be horrible, and that didn't end so well. My undergrad, I did a Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science. I then did 2 years of postgraduate work for mechanical engineering, and then did graduate school for mechanical engineering, finished that, so I was never going back to school. Did some time doing Ph.D. program for biomedical, ended up switching from there, dropped out of that program, and then went over to the exercise physiology department because I didn't really want to do any more math. And then ironically, I got assigned 2 projects on heart rate variability and metabolic flexibility, which, as you guys all know, involve more math. So I did that program. I've published some stuff on study looking at energy drinks, some HRV, some other stuff. So used metabolic carts, God, probably hundreds of tests like in the lab. And so when I first met you guys, it was super exciting to find that there was a metabolic card that can do breath by breath analysis, so kind of medical grade assessments, and that was semi-affordable. So that's how I got involved.
Perfect. And I remember this was several years ago, and it has been a pleasure working with you, Mike, from the very beginning. So to start, our agenda for our discussion today, I would like to ask with resting metabolic rate. It's a very important pillar of human physiology. It's a cornerstone in order for someone to personalize his nutrition and make sure that his nutrition is aligned with his exercise. But I would like to hear your thoughts on what do you think resting metabolic, what the value of resting metabolic rate is, and if you could, kindly explain what resting metabolic rate is for our audience, for someone who is not familiar with the term.
Yeah, so resting metabolic rate is just simply how many calories does your body burn to keep the lights on. So literally, if you were to do nothing, like even watching TV would be a little too much work. If you would do absolutely nothing but just exist, that's how many calories you need to just keep the lights on, keep your body functioning. The main thing I use it for is a lot of people think their metabolism, quote unquote, is broken, that they've crushed their resting metabolic rate, even though they haven't done anything that crazy. They usually tend to think that their resting metabolic rate is much lower than what it is. So I mainly use it in practice to show people that, nope, it looks like in a vast majority of cases, it's just fine. And most people are relatively shocked at how many calories it is. I've had clients come in, they're like, oh, I'm sure mine is, like 900 calories per day. Everybody thinks they're the outlier. And, there are some weird outliers. Those people do exist, but they're not the norm. And more, 99 times out of 100, they look at the number and they're kind of shocked as to how many calories they burn. And again, this is not exercise. This is not movement. This is not doing anything else. This is just the bare amount of calories you need for your body to, sort of function and keep the lights on.
Yes, and it's very interesting what you said, that many people are shocked that the resting metabolic rate is much higher than they expected. And this is what we've seen with some of our clients, that when they understand that they need to eat a right amount of calories, in many cases, they were significantly under eating that.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, this resulted on a metabolic slowdown, which I would love to hear your opinion on this. So they were doing like cycles of overeating, then undereating, overeating, and undereating. And as a result, they were not losing weight. In many cases, they were gaining weight. So when they understood that they have a baseline, and then that they need to be a little bit more the baseline to gain weight, or a little bit below the baseline to lose weight, this really clarified and simplified their nutrition for them. So this brings me to my next question, Mike. How do you think that one's resting metabolic rate could be improved?
Yeah, that's
So
a
if
good
it's
question.
slow, how? Yeah.
Yeah. So my hypothesis for years was that you can radically change your resting metabolic rate. And my thought right now is you can change it, but probably not as much as what we realize. I mean, even adding more muscle will burn more calories, but it's really not that many. Now, if you look at it over the course of many, many years and you're at a significantly different weight, then yes, that will. But again, I think there's a little bit of the misconception that when people hear metabolic rate, they forget that the RMR is the resting metabolic rate. It's not accounting for movement. So say, for example, you add 20 pounds of muscle over like 5 years. Will your resting metabolic rate go up a little bit? Yeah, it will. Is it anything super significant? Probably not. However, you're now carrying that extra amount of weight around doing everything else that you're doing. Walking, exercise, your performance is probably higher. You can increase your work capacity. So you do have the capacity to burn more calories overall, but a lot of that has to do with the sort of the moving component of it. So on the flip side, I've looked at some of the literature too on people who are anorexic or people who have different pathologies. And yes, resting RMR goes down, but it doesn't change as much as what people would think. I think the lowest number I've been able to find that was verified in a study was around 950 calories per day, right? Because if you took a poll, people would be like, oh, mine's definitely below 1,000. I've had clients, they'd be like, I'm sure it's less than 800 calories per day. And you do the measurement and they're not even close, right? So the good part is you probably can't do anything as quote unquote damaging as what we think. But to your point, when people see the actual number, I do think that it prevents them from these cycles of drastically dropping their calories, and then they become ridiculously hungry, and then they kind of overeat, and then they do this kind of yo-yo thing back and forth. And one of the things I watch a lot in clients is their performance. So even if you're just a recreational lifter, your performance in the gym is always going down. You're literally getting less stimulus to do what you want. And odds are you probably slashed your calories too aggressive. And then people will see that, and then they add a little bit too many, or obviously you get very hungry. If anyone has tried to dramatically drop your calories for a couple of days, you get really hungry. And then if you're not really on a plan or following anything, it's very easy to then overeat on the other side. So I think there is a value to seeing the number and saying that, yeah, we just want to be a little bit under this, total daily energy expenditure. So how many total calories, including movement and non-movement? RMR is obviously the non-movement component. And then once people see that number, they realize it's higher than what they realized. And so they can feel comfortable eating a few more calories and still be in a deficit. But the key is they can do that day in and day out and not end up kind of on this seesaw, yo-yo type thing where they're kind of all over the board all the time.
Exactly. And Doctor, what you said about, when you accelerate your metabolism, you see the effect not only on your resting metabolic rate, but also on the calories that you burn during your daily activities. And during your exercise, and this is where this effect is even more amplified. I find this, of significant importance, and I would like to ask, how you're using this with your clients and how it has helped them. I mean, this thing, realizing that when you accelerate your metabolism, not only you're going to, as you said, increase your resting metabolic rate, but during a 2-mile walk, you are actually going to burn more calories. When you go to the gym, you're actually going to burn more calories. And this is a very significant boost in your caloric burn on a daily basis that will definitely help in achieving weight loss, if this is the goal.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of, again, even for general population, to look at performance, because at base level, you need to give your body a stimulus in order for it to get better. So a lot of people, when they do training, they're only looking at how hard it felt. And as you know, you can do lots of stuff that feels horrible that may not be super effective in the long term. So a good example is like high intensity interval work. You can do horrible things that feel difficult, but if you're not literally creating more output, you're physically getting better. And part of that is you're going to be burning more calories because you can do a higher output. It's going to become very difficult to sustain that because, one, you're not giving your body the stimulus to physically function at a higher capacity. And two, you actually don't have the capacity to burn as many calories at that point. Like even walking, if you're add more muscle, yes, there is some efficiency of walking and running that will increase over time. But if you just, the experiment I have people do is if they have a weight vest, go for a walk one morning, just normal, and then put just a 20-pound weight vest on and do a walk the next day with that on. And you'll notice that, oh, wow, this does feel different. You can monitor heart rate, you can monitor whatever else. You are going to expend more calories because you're moving more of that around at the same time. So I like to, calories in, calories out works. But I think the mistake people make is they just go to do things that are really hard and not necessarily look at the output of what they're doing. And I think that's an easy way to just keep tracking and doing things that feel hard. And your assumption is you must be going in the right direction. When you put actual numbers on it or you look at performance, you realize that it still felt hard, but you're literally doing less than you were before.
Yeah. Absolutely. And even in cases we've seen, and I would love to hear your experience as well, in cases of weight loss, like we've seen, and this is supported by the literature, that 90% of diets fail long-term because of the weight loss plateau, meaning that as you're losing weight, your metabolism slows down and it becomes harder and harder to lose weight. Like you can have some easy wins the first 1, 2, 3 months, but if you don't lose weight sustainably, this will result on a metabolic slowdown and eventually someone will hit the wall. So on the contrary, if you monitor your metabolism as you're losing weight, combine it with the right nutrition, the right amount of calories, the right strength training, you could kind of reverse this metabolic slowdown. So yeah, doctor, I would love to hear how you're using metabolic analysis with your weight loss clients during the weight loss phase.
Yes, the big thing that I use it for is we can look at resting metabolic rate and do it over repeated measurements. Because again, there's this sort of myth that, if I'm losing weight, my resting metabolic rate is gonna, just go in the trash and it's gonna go from, say, 1,600 calories to below 1,000, or like these completely unrealistic numbers that it just don't happen. So you can show them that, it might change a little bit, but it's relatively super minor. Again, assuming you're doing it, in a rather, healthy way, you're not doing anything crazy. Even when you do crazy stuff, it doesn't really change that much. The other part I use it for is, which we'll talk about, is like just VO2 max testing, which is a good marker for your aerobic metabolism. So we can show people that, yep, you're losing weight, your body comp is getting better, and your performance is actually increasing. And if you use the standardized measurement of VO2 max, it is graded per body weight. So if you took the exact same person, left their fitness level the same, and they lost, let's say, 30 pounds, their normalized VO2 max will actually go up because they have that same output, but at a lighter body weight. So we can then use that and show them that, look, you're actually increasing your overall performance. It's not getting worse. And then after that, you can do fancy stuff. You can put it on them, have them do like a standard walk or something like that. If you're trying to measure so non-exercise activity thermogenesis, just walking and moving around. And sometimes those numbers may change a little bit because they're at a lighter body weight. But most of the time you can compensate for that by just having them do a little bit more exercise. So just showing them that, yeah, these numbers can change over time, but if you're doing it in a healthy way, you're not losing a ton of lean body mass, that they're going to be rather static, and some of them might actually get better. And I think that's a underappreciated component of the motivation, like you said, to get them to do it consistently day in and day out. Because it's just human nature. You don't want to do things over and over and not see progress. So if you can show them progress of like, hey, maybe your body weight has plateaued, but your VO2 max, got better. Your resting metabolic rate is the same. You're doing these things that we can show you that you are making improvements. Because the other part is that humans think that everything is just linear. If I just do these things, I'm going to lose the mythical, half a pound, 1 pound, 1.5 pounds every week, week in, week out, like the whole time. And if you've ever looked at any weight loss graph, even just body weight, you'll see it goes up, 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 down, down, but the trend goes down. And so I think I had this conversation with a client literally last week. We looked at her overall trend over the past 4 weeks, and she was losing about, 3/4 of a pound per week. But she was getting so hung up at the numbers on the scale that she thought she wasn't making any progress at all. But when we stopped and we took a higher view, looked at the data, she was like, oh, wow, I actually am on track. And I said, your performance in the gym is going up, your VO2 max is getting better. Like all your markers are getting better, but it's easy to get stuck in the day-to-day numbers and also just assume that everything is linear, when in reality, it's going to be very much a non-linear process.
Yeah. You've put it perfectly, doctor. And I love what you said, that it's part of human nature that we want to see the results when we put the effort. And in some cases, see results in the mirror might take some time. So being able to quantify this in between phases until we reach our goals, being able to map our journey, in many cases it's make or break when it comes to motivation and retention on being disciplined on this program. Perfect. Mike, you mentioned about VO2 max and about the aerobic aspect of your clients. I would love if you could explain to our audience like what VO2 max is for our listeners who do not already know this, and how this is linked to aerobic capacity and longevity. And there is a lot of, I know that biological age and longevity are a little bit of buzzwords lately, but what we've seen and what's supported by the literature, there is a lot of findings and a lot of meta-analysis and a lot of unanimous statements by organizations highlight that VO2 max is the go-to metric when it comes to longevity and biological age.
Yeah, so VO2 max just simply is the volume of oxygen that is maximal. So what you would do in a lab setting or at home, if you have the equipment, you have people do these different types of ramp tests. It's just basically progressively harder and harder exercise of different forms. And you're looking at primarily the volume of oxygen, right? So VO2 max. And you're looking for at a point where that actually hits a plateau where it stays the same. So even though they might be able to eke out a little bit more performance, they're not doing it necessarily because the volume of oxygen is changing. And so that by definition is the VO2 max, and it's the volume of oxygen that your body is using. And it turns out that that's a good marker for your aerobic metabolism. So just simply how well can your body use oxygen to run that part of its metabolism. And what we see is that we've had the ability to look at this in terms of exercise science for many, many decades. So the nice part is most early exercise phys labs had metabolic carts. They had ways to do aerobic training. And so we've got pretty good data on this going back several decades now. And what we find is that in terms of mortality, which is sort of crudely, but it's easy to measure, is at the end of a study, how many people were alive and how many people were not alive. So it's what they call a hard endpoint. That VO2 max is probably one of the top things in terms of predictors of mortality. Doesn't mean other stuff doesn't matter. It just means that if you compare especially people who are really good and people who are very, very poor, there is a huge difference, sometimes 30, possibly even 40% difference in mortality from the people who are not very good to people who are really good. If you compare that amount to pretty much any other factor, it's, from what I've seen so far, it's probably the biggest factor, especially if you compare very unconditioned people to, kind of elite level aerobic athletes.
Yes, and what we've seen, and I would love to hear your experience on this, is that we could drastically change our VO2 max. I mean, it's, of course, there is the genetics factor, but it has to do with our habits. Like if someone doesn't work out and starts working out, the changes are pretty rapid. So I would love to hear what you have observed with your athletes, with your clients, doctor.
Yeah, so VO2 max does have a very high genetic component. You can look at the heritage trial for that. But when you look at that data, what it generally means is that some people kind of win the genetic lottery and their VO2 max genetically is just pretty damn high. Can those people get a little bit better? Yes. Some people, their VO2 max genetically is quite a bit lower. So one of my professors at the University of Minnesota, he was the main guy on the heritage study. And what they did was they tried to look at adults and they tried to look at their kids because they're trying to trace the genetic component. And he was telling us stories of he'd have, groups of families that would come in that were these kind of Harley biker dudes that would smoke all the time, didn't train, didn't exercise. And their VO2 max sometimes was higher than recreational people who trained. They just happened to win the genetic lottery. The good part, though, is that when people hear that, they just go, oh, it's all genetics, they can't do anything. And that's actually not true. VO2 max has a pretty high, what I would consider a plastic component, meaning that if you're doing the correct training, you can actually pretty reliably see pretty big changes in it. Like what I've noticed anecdotally is if you gave me programming and said, okay, you've got two athletes, one, we want to add as much lean body mass as possible, muscle. The other one, we want to increase their VO2 max as much as possible. I would say increasing their VO2 max generally is a lot more consistent, meaning I can give them a decent program and the vast majority of people will respond. Could they still add more muscle? Yeah, but I just find that is even more genetically variable in terms of the results from the applied training. So the good part in English means that if you do a good program and you're trying to increase the VO2 max, you can not guarantee, but pretty reliably say it's going to go up to a certain point. If you're trying to get, super high levels, yeah, that's a different story. But most people are already pretty low. And the benefit is the lower you are, the easier it is to see an increase. And you paradoxically don't have to do a whole lot to see an increase. And if we look at the data related to mortality, the biggest change is at the bottom end of the curve. So if your VO2 max is really poor, you start training for 6, 8, even a couple months, you can see a pretty big increase. And that increase relative to your risk actually drops your risk quite a bit. So if you just go from very poor to good, like that's a huge change in your overall mortality. Does it take some training? Does it take some effort? Yes, but it's not really that that hard per se. Like I've had clients one client a couple of years ago, I think her VO2 max was like 17. It was horrible.
That's, yeah, pretty low.
Really, really low. And she didn't have any pathologies, she didn't have any diseases. She just never trained it, was about 30 pounds overweight. And it took us 6 months. And if you look at just a population average, it took 6 months for her to get into about 50% of the population average for VO2 max for her age. So that's a huge increase in her case. And it took a few months, but only took half a year. Right. So you can see pretty big movements in your overall score and, probably less time than, if you're trying to add muscle or trying to add some of the other things. They're still beneficial. But to me, VO2 max is very trainable in the vast majority of the population.
100% agreed with you, doctor. And what I find very impressive is that all the studies that you mentioned show that every time that we increase our VO2 max by 1 unit of VO2 max, the overall mortality drops by 15%, which is like to your example with this client of yours that started from a VO2 max of 19. Where did she end up?
I don't remember the exact number, to be honest. If I were to guess, I want to say she was in, I think, the low 30s, 31, 32. So again, comparatively speaking, not super high compared to what she started at. Like, that's light years difference.
Exactly. And this is like, what is it? It's like, let's say, 3 to 4 mets. So she increased her VO2 max. This means that she decreased her mortality risk by 45 to 60%, which is like in just 6 months. It's crazy, like the power of exercise. And there is so much, we all know the power of exercise, but what I find amazing is that we're constantly impressed that it's even more powerful than what we thought it was. The case study that you mentioned, I think speaks for itself. I mean, not many things could decrease mortality risk by 45 to 60% in around 6 months. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah. And the other part on that too that people forget is that her main complaint when we started working was body comp goals, but she's like, I just have no energy to do anything, and yeah, we made some changes to sleep and nutrition and other stuff, but if your VO2 max is super low, right, your body most of the time, with the exception of high intensity exercise, is using your aerobic system, which is measured by VO2 max, to literally create cellular energy, ATP. So the example I use is it's like having a little 3-cylinder car that you're trying to redline just to get to the grocery store, right? You need a 8-cylinder or 10-cylinder car. You just need a bigger engine because you have the capacity then to create a lot more energy at paradoxically a much lower cost. You may only have to hit 2,000 RPMs to hit the same speed as what you did before. So everything else that you're doing then becomes easier. So she was actually able to exercise on top of, being a mom, having a busy schedule. And she was able to stay with that like consistently then because she didn't feel like she was tired all the time. And when we stopped working together, she was still, exercising, went from 0 days a week to 5 days a week and felt much, much better. So I think if we hadn't addressed that VO2 max component, continuing to do exercise would have been much more difficult because she just didn't have the energy she felt like to do it. I think there's a lot of other carryovers that are going to allow her to do that then, consistently, day in, day out, year in, and then for decades going forward.
Absolutely. And doctor, I like the way you put it, about the size of the engine, that, VO2 max is increasing the size of our engine. Using your analogy, if we were to discuss about the fuels that our engine is using, and the benefits of zone 2 training and fat burning efficiency, relying on fats rather than carbs, what do you think are the benefits of teaching our body to relying on fats rather than carbs during exercise, and of course at rest? What does this mean about our metabolic health and about our overall health, and also about helping us to achieve our goals in wellness.
Yeah, I think there's pretty good data now to show that how well your body uses fat during relatively lower intensity exercise or just day-to-day living is a pretty darn good marker for health. Now, again, it gets confusing because the body is very much survival based, and it's going to figure out a way to create energy. And in the example of, so general population, their question they would have is, okay, well, I just want to increase my fat burning. What should I do? Should I do fasted training? Should I just do all zone 2 training? Yeah, some of that can have a component for sure. But again, the thing that people forget is that if you just gave them, let's say you could magically give them a higher VO2 max, the amount of calories they would burn from fat is going to be much higher in those who have a higher VO2 max versus those who have a low VO2 max. So to me, it's looking at, okay, yep, the percentage of fuels you're using during exercise, and then what is the size of the engine. So if I want to use more fuel, the first thing I want to do is I want to get a bigger engine, and then I can worry about efficiency. So they're two different things. Like if you're trying to maximize the efficiency of a 3-cylinder engine, there's only so much performance you're going to be able to extract out of it.
Yeah.
If I have a 10-cylinder engine, it's going to be very easy to extract a lot more performance out of it. I think a lot of people are getting hung up that they're trying to, burn more calories from fat when their size of their engine is just really, really small. So they're just not burning much, period. So what I do with clients is we'll look at their VO2 max. It's kind of like the size of the engine. And we want to slowly get that bigger over time. And then if we want to change the percentage of fuels they're using, we would do stuff like you can do some fasted training, fasted walks. You can do more, like you mentioned, zone 2 training, which is a very low intensity but longer duration training that has kind of different cardiac adaptations. But because it's low to moderate intensity, you don't need carbohydrates to run that exercise. And what you see in people who have a low VO2 max or under like really, really high amounts of stress is their body has to figure out a way to create energy. So it's going to shift over to start using carbohydrates. And carbohydrates in general are better reserved for higher intensity exercise. But if you have someone who has a low VO2 max or has a really high amount of stress, low capacity, the body has to figure out a way to get energy. And so it's going to shift over to start using carbohydrates sooner. And the last component of that too is that how well healthy recreational people use fat during the low to moderate intensity exercise is extremely variable. It's probably like, from the 3 studies I've looked at, like 10 to 93%, meaning that you just take people off the street who are healthy, don't have any health problems, recreationally active, not necessarily athletes, but they train a little bit, they do exercise. Some of them are really good at using fat during low to moderate intensity exercise, and some of them are absolutely horrible at doing it. Godecki did one study on that. Helges did one study in 1999. I did a study on that 2015. And what you find is it's just really variable. So I think one of the assumptions in the population is that, and this is my assumption before I looked at literature of, oh, well, if they're healthy people, then they must just use more fat at a lower intensity. And what we find is that's not necessarily true. The good part is that can also be trainable, right? You can do specific training and you can definitely increase that percentage that's coming from fat. And when you're doing low to moderate intensity exercise, you don't need to use carbohydrates for that. And fat is going to be a much better fuel source.
Absolutely. And I love the way you put it, that, by simultaneously working on the size of the engine and on the fuel sources, you have like, two arrows pointing in the same direction. And this has the overall effect of teaching our bodies to become better fat burners and have a better metabolic health. Mike, I would like to ask you, we've heard about training zones, zone 2 that we were discussing about is one training zone. I would love you if you could explain, to the PNOE community, what's so special about training zones and what's the benefit of every training zone, and how metabolic testing is a better way of determining the training zones and the thresholds than other methods who kind of approximate this, like lactate thresholds, and why breath analysis is the go-to way to determine training zones.
Yeah, so for people who are not familiar, they may not even heard of training zones, it's just a way for cardiovascular exercise to equate the intensity of exercise. So from, zone 1 to very low intensity, zone 2 is, moderate, all the way up to super high intensity. And when you look at it, each one of these kind of zones has a little bit different adaptations. So if you go all the way up to the highest zone and you're doing like just super high intensity, 20 seconds, all out, fuel source wise, it's a little bit more carbohydrates. You spin off some lactate and some other byproducts, but everybody knows you can't sustain that for a long period of time. So lower intensity work, you can sustain for a much longer period of time. The lower the intensity, the more fuel source primarily should be from fats. If you look at it from for example, from the cardiac system, you can imagine that when you're doing very high intensity work, the heart has to beat really, really fast and is very limited because the heart itself has to get blood flow back. And you've got so much blood that's actually going through the heart very fast. If you go down to your lower intensities, such as zone 2, you're doing continuous work, but it's much more of a moderate intensity. So there you can get more blood flow back to the heart. It's much more of a continuous moderate intensity. Your adaptations you get from it are going to be a little bit different. So the takeaway I would say is for people starting an aerobic program, doing a baseline of zone 2 training is probably going to be a good place to start. Just like if you were to build a pyramid, you kind of need a good base to work on it. So for programming for clients, I have them start with like a zone 2 training, and then I'll still keep in 1 day of higher intensity work. I want to kind of preserve a little bit of those adaptations, but that may be something super simple like warm up on a rower and just do, 2 sessions, 20 seconds all out, right? It's nothing super crazy. And let's see, what was the second part of your question you said about the metabolic heart? So
yes,
yeah. So to figure it out, like the general way that people do it is by heart rate, which is okay if you don't have anything else to use. The hard part about that is it's based off of population data. And from what I've seen, sometimes it's accurate and sometimes it's not. So like the general thing I tend to see is people come in, they're like, yeah, I just had a client a couple weeks ago. Hey, we're doing all this zone 2 stuff. And we look at his data and he's probably zone 3 or zone 4, meaning
wow,
he thinks he's doing low intensity work. He's actually doing higher intensity work, which in and of itself isn't bad. But when you think you're doing something and you're not doing that thing, you can kind of run into issues.
exactly.
So the best way, go ahead.
No, I mean, it's this is a perfect example. I mean, he was like this client of yours, he was putting in the effort. He
was putting more
doing
effort.
zone 2. Exactly, he was putting more effort actually. And he was kind of misled by the prediction of the zone 2 from his heart rate data, because as you said, just demographics, and it's, in some cases it's, accurate, in many cases it's highly off, like the example you mentioned.
Yeah, and one of the issues, even just max heart rates, right? So everyone's heard the 220 minus your age. I think the standard deviation on that's like plus or minus like 17, meaning just the prediction of your max heart rate, not your zones, just the prediction of your max heart rate. There's a huge amount of variability in that. So one way around it is to measure an actual max. If you don't have a metabolic heart and you want to try to get a little bit more accurate, just go out and actually measure what your maximal heart rate is. Take your zones off of that. That doesn't guarantee it's going to be 100% accurate, but it'll be a little bit closer. So when you use a metabolic cart, you can actually look at the air exchange. So what are you doing for oxygen and what are you doing for CO2? And that's what's going to actually determine the intensity of exercise. So because you're measuring a variable that's closer to what is actually going on during exercise, you're going to be a lot more accurate. Like you said, some of the other things they'll do is looking at lactate. So they'll prick your finger or earlobe or whatever they're doing. They'll look at lactate. So lactate is a byproduct. People have heard of lactic acid. It's actually lactate plus hydrogen ions. So if you've done exercise, you feel that burning sensation in your muscle. It's actually not lactic acid that disassociates into lactate, which gets used as a fuel, and then actually literally hydrogen ions, like pH, like the concentration of hydrogen ions. You're literally dumping acid into your muscles, which is why they burn. But people will sometimes use lactate because as lactate goes up, the hydrogen ions also go up. So paradoxically, when you do lactate testing, you're measuring lactate, but you're really trying to use it as a surrogate for hydrogen ion concentration. And it can be okay if you're doing higher intensity stuff, but the analogy I use with people is even in the best case scenario, imagine I'm going to look at water level in a bathtub, and I've got the water faucet turned all the way on, and I've got the drain also open. If I'm just doing a prick and I'm looking at lactate or blood glucose or whatever metric I'm looking at, I'm only looking at the level of water in the bathtub. That doesn't tell me how much water is coming in. It doesn't tell me how much water is going out. So you're looking at just this one kind of static measure. And you can determine some stuff from that. But again, my bias is that you're looking at a parameter that's one step removed from the main thing that you're trying to look at. Or if you're using indirect calorimetry, metabolic carts, you're looking at as best we have now of the direct indicator of exercise intensity, which is going to be basically just simply oxygen and CO2.
That's a great way of putting it. I really like your analogy with the bathtub. It's very descriptive and it really paints the picture. And like what we this with lactate testing, what we've seen, and this has been described in the literature as well. There can be a lot of volatility from like whether you get the blood samples from the finger or from the ear, which doesn't make any sense. I mean, I'm the same person, my thresholds are defined. Why do I get different lactate thresholds when I get the blood sample from my finger or from my ear? And this blends perfectly with your analogy with with the bathtub, because the level of water is different in both cases, because it's perfect. So
and I'd say just in practicality, if you've ever tried, and I've tried this, it sucks, do exercise. So let's say you're doing zone 2 training, you're doing continuous work. Like, could you in theory on a bike probably prick your finger and get lactate? Maybe it works okay. But as you get to higher intensities, or if you're using a different modality, let's say you're running, let's say you're using a rower, like to stop and to do that measurement is a pain. It's very sensitive to any extra fluid because it's pulling such a small amount of blood. If you don't wipe the sweat off your finger or you get a little bit of extra fluid in there, the reading is quote unquote accurate, but you're not measuring what you think you're measuring. So you can get a little bit of different readings. The strips tend to be expensive. And if you're using it for high intensity stuff, if you've ever done like a 3-minute wind gate test, so we did this as part of a course, get on a rower, warm up, go as hard as you can for 3 minutes, and then immediately measure lactate afterwards. Like doing it on yourself it's really hard.
Yeah, for sure. And you have all the sweat and liquids affecting your measurement. Excellent. Doctor, we covered so many interesting things today, and I love the way you explained, the first principles of what we discussed today. It was a great pleasure, having you today at the PNOΗ podcast. Thank you very much for taking the time. And I would love to reconnect after a couple of months to, discuss other topics around metabolic analysis and other case studies that you've seen with your clients.
Yeah, thank you. And then One other thing I would add that I'd be curious as to what you've seen or your feedback from your listeners is when you do an RMR test, you can get an RER, right? So respiratory exchange ratio for in English, that just means what percentage of fat or carbohydrates you're using. What I've noticed over the years is I think that number is accurate, meaning the machine is giving you the correct number. Over the last couple of years, I have my doubts in especially higher level athletes if it is truly representative of what we think it is. So I have an athlete who was eating 450 grams of carbs per day, and we did his RMR, and his RER was higher on the carbohydrate side. I think it was like 0.9, which would say he's using more carbohydrates. So the theory would be maybe he's not that good at using fat. However, when we retested him, tested him again, he got like, 0.92. However, when we stuck him on a bike at just like 50 watts, so just like really, really super low intensity, fasted, his RER dropped to 0.72. So it dropped and showed that he's actually really good at using fat. So I'm curious as to athletes who are higher on the carbohydrate intake, if that may affect their kind of RMR resting fuel usage. But when you add a little bit of stress to the system, you stimulate that system a little bit, that appears to quote unquote kind of normalize that number. So I haven't seen much literature on that, but that's something I've always just been kind of curious about.
That's a good point. I mean, what I read on this topic is that the fat utilization during exercise is linked to the fat utilization, to the fuel utilization at rest. But in cases, it's not, one-on-one correlated,
Right.
meaning that you may, like, your resting, your RER at rest is linked to the breakdown of your nutrition, whether you're eating carbs, fats. It's more linked to the to your nutrition. Whereas when you work out, it has to do more with the food, with the fuel utilization during exercise. So what you have observed is something that we have seen as well, and it is supported in the literature. Someone might be a good fat burner during exercise and a bad fat burner at rest, particularly if you have endurance athletes who eat a lot of carbs for their training. The distinction in this cases may be even more significant, as you have observed.
Yeah, and this is probably definitely an outlier case, right? His VO2 max is pretty high. He's training a lot. I do agree that in general population, what I've seen is that it does tend to correlate quite well. But when you get into other cases, it tends to not correlate as well, which is interesting.
Yes, absolutely. And that was a great addition to for our listeners today. Perfect. Mike, would you like to add anything else to our discussion?
No, I think that's it. If people have any questions or need any more information from me, you can find me on my website. It's just miketnelson.com. And most of the information I have goes out over the free Insiders newsletter. Just go to miketnelson.com and you can sign up to the newsletter there, and we'll send it right to your inbox. And you can tell me you heard me on this podcast, just hit reply, and I'll send you a cool free gift.
Perfect. This is something that the PNOE community would love for sure. Excellent, Mike. Thank you again for your time today. It was a great pleasure. I really enjoyed our discussion, and it's great the way that you explain these important things around metabolic analysis are definitely actionable for our audience. So thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on here. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye, Mike.
Thank you. Bye-bye.